You're listening to Tim Bulkeley's 5-Minute Bible. Is Paul abusing Genesis? There'll probably always be discussion and argument about the use the New Testament writers make of the Old Testament. I've dealt with some of the issues in my podcasts on Jesus fulfilling the Old Testament. At church, we're working through the book of Galatians, and the example of Paul's use of Genesis at the end of chapter 4 struck me quite forcibly. It reads like this: For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and the other by a free woman. One, the child of the slave, was born according to the flesh. The other, the child of the free woman, was born through the promise. Now, this is an allegory. These women are two covenants. One woman, in fact, is Hagar from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem. You see what it's like. It's, to modern ears, thoroughly confusing stuff. All that talk of allegory puts us off for a start. Interestingly, it's a word that's only used the once in the New Testament. So perhaps we shouldn't take it for granted that it means what we think it does. Maybe it means that these two women are a picture or an analogy, or in some way represent the two covenants. But all that stuff about Hagar being Mount Sinai in Arabia, who is also the present Jerusalem, is a clear indication that Paul is not talking literally. Hagar was an Egyptian slave girl, nothing to do with either Arabia or Jerusalem. And it gets weirder. But the other woman corresponds to the Jerusalem above. She is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, Rejoice, you childless one, quoting from Isaiah, who bear no children, burst into song and shout, you who endure no birth pangs, for the children of the desolate woman are more numerous than the children of the one who is married. Sarah only had one child. Now, you, my friends, are children of the promise like Isaac. But just as at that time the child who was born according to the flesh persecuted the child who was born according to the Spirit, so it is now also. But what does Scripture say? Drive out the slave and her child, for the child of the slave will not share the inheritance of the child of the free woman, which seems to be a quote from memory from Genesis 21:10, though it's interesting to notice the little changes that Paul makes as he goes along. In the NRSV, it read, Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit with my son Isaac. It's not so much the Bible as Sarah that Paul is quoting with approval. He goes on and concludes the passage, So then, my friends, we are children, not of the slave, but of the free woman. Crikey. Now that is strange Bible interpretation, and if your pastor was to preach it to you on Sunday, you'd have serious doubts about him or her. But let's look at the passage in Genesis 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Now, this is all thoroughly culturally appropriate stuff. In the ancient Near East, that was what you did. If your wife was childless and she was willing, you slept with her bondservant, and the children counted for you, thus preserving the wife from childlessness. Except, notice how Sarah puts it. You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. She acknowledges that her lack of children is Yahweh's doing. And then she tries, by human response, to fix what God has not fixed. Go into my slave girl. Abraham's story, we've been told time and again through Scripture, but in Genesis as well, is about faith and promise. What we have here is an example of a rejection of the promise and of the grace of God, and an attempt to secure the desired child by human means. So you see, Paul's interpretation of it isn't quite as strange as it first seemed, because what Paul is on about in Galatians, and especially in chapter 4, is this great gulf between human attempts to sort things out by obedience to law and the grace of God. It's just that as we read him, Paul seems to be putting down Hagar and elevating Sarah. But the point he's making is a good one. In this story, we have a conflict between mercy and grace on the one side and human striving on the other. Paul's point is good, and it fits with the point that the author of Genesis was making. But to get there, He sides with Sarah and puts down Hagar in a way that a non-Jewish reader, less attached to the ancestres, is less likely to favour. Like I said, a really interesting example of New Testament exegesis of the Old, and one which raises lots of questions, even after the most obvious surface questions have been dealt with. Bye for now.